The gunshot came from inside the barn, and for 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then the horses screamed. Not the sound of hooves against wood, not the ordinary complaint of animals startled by weather. This was something else, high and raw, carrying across 400 acres of frozen Montana grassland like a warning nobody had time to heed. A woman in a canvas coat stood frozen at the porch rail, one hand still gripping a letter she had been reading only a moment before, her eyes fixed on the barn doors as if they might explain themselves. Snow had just begun to fall. It would not stop for 3 days. That was the last ordinary morning Adeline Vance would have for a long time. And it would take a stranger with a veterinarian's hands and a carpenter's silence to help her survive what came after. If you have ever watched something break slowly, a marriage, a family business, a person's trust in their own judgment, you already know that collapse rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as small decisions. Stay tonight, and don't leave before we get to the part where a woman signs a letter asking a stranger to marry her out of necessity, and the man who answers it is hiding a truth that could either save her or destroy them both. If you're watching this in the evening, tell me where from. Comment your city below. And if stories about quiet courage and second chances mean something to you, hit like and subscribe, because this one is going to stay with you. Now, let's go back to where it started. 3 weeks before the gunshot, Adeline Vance stood in the same spot on the porch, watching frost climb the fence posts like something patient and deliberate. 52 years old, spine straight from 3 decades of ranch work, she moved through her mornings the way a person moves through a house they no longer recognize. Carefully, as though the floor might not hold. The ranch had a name once, painted in white letters on a board above the main gate. Vance and Calloway. The paint had peeled years ago, and only the ghost of the second name remained. A pale outline where Warren Calloway's letters used to be before creditors took even the memory of him seriously. Warren was the man Adeline's late husband, Thomas, had trusted with half of everything they owned. Warren was also the reason Adeline now sat across from bank officers twice a month, watching numbers that refused to improve no matter how early she woke or how late she worked. She fed 41 draft horses that autumn, Belgian and Percheron mostly, animals bred for pulling timber and plow, not for racing or show. Animals that ate like small trucks and required hands too experienced to hire cheaply. 2 years earlier, there had been 63 horses and a foreman named Cole who understood the breeding lines better than Adeline understood her own family tree. Cole left when the checks stopped clearing on time. The horses that remained were the ones nobody wanted to buy, plus one, a broodmare named Duchess, in full to a bloodline worth more than the house Adeline slept in. The last asset standing between the ranch and a foreclosure notice already sitting, unopened, in a drawer in the kitchen. Thomas had been dead 14 months. The official story, the one Adeline told the bank, the neighbors, the 2 grown children who called on Sundays out of obligation more than warmth, was that his heart had simply failed, the way hearts do in men who work too hard for too long. It was not entirely a lie, but it left out the 18 months before his death, the ones Adeline had spent quietly rerouting decisions around a man who forgot which pasture held which herd, who once tried to pay a feed bill with a check from an account closed a decade earlier, who, 3 weeks before a stroke took him in his sleep, sold Iron Hand, the ranch's prize stallion, and the entire genetic future of their breeding program, to a buyer in Idaho for a third of his worth, without telling her, without anyone's authorization. In a fog of confusion, Adeline had been hiding from the world because she could not bear to watch her husband be diminished in public. She never told anyone that. Not the bank, not her children, not the ledger she kept in a drawer beside the foreclosure notice, filled with numbers that never quite forgave her for staying silent. The letter she had been holding on the porch was addressed to a placement agency 2 counties over, one that specialized in contract labor for isolated ranches. Men willing to trade a winter of hard work for room, board, and a modest wage, sometimes men escaping something, sometimes men simply between lives. Adeline had rewritten the letter 4 times before sending it. The final version asked for a man experienced in carpentry and heavy livestock work, willing to enter into a formal work-in-residence arrangement through the winter months. She had used the word husband only because the agency's paperwork required a legal category for a live-in arrangement on land this remote, and marriage of convenience, cold, transactional, paper only, was the fastest, cheapest route through the county's residency requirements. It was not romance. It was survival wearing a legal disguise. She sealed the envelope without rereading it and walked it to the mailbox herself because she did not trust herself to change her mind twice. 9 days later, a truck she didn't recognize came up the long gravel drive, moving slower than a man in a hurry, faster than a man unsure of his welcome. The truck stopped at a respectful distance from the house, and the man who stepped out of it did not immediately reach for a duffel bag or announce himself the way hired men usually did. He stood for a moment, hands loose at his sides, taking in the barn's sagging roofline, the fence line needing repair along the northern pasture, the particular quiet of a place that had once employed a dozen hands and now employed one exhausted woman. Jonathan Reyes was 55, built like a man who had spent a lifetime lifting things carefully rather than carelessly. Gray threading through dark hair, he kept cut close and practical. He wore a canvas coat similar to Adeline's, though newer, and carried himself with an economy of motion that made him seem, from a distance, younger than his face suggested up close. Adeline came down the porch steps with her arms crossed, less from cold than from the particular defensiveness of a woman meeting a stranger she had just agreed to share a house with. She had expected, without quite admitting she'd expected anything, someone rougher. A drifter, a man with calloused hands and little else, grateful for shelter and unbothered by details. What she got instead was a man who glanced at the barn twice before he looked at her, the second glance lingering a half-second too long on something only he seemed to notice. He introduced himself with a handshake, not a smile, which suited her. His grip was deliberate, testing nothing, offering nothing extra. "You said carpentry and stock work in the letter," he said. "You didn't say how many animals." 41, she answered. "Draft breed. One in full." He nodded slowly, the kind of nod that seemed to be doing arithmetic behind it. Then he reached into the truck and pulled out, instead of a toolbox, a canvas satchel. Heavy, the kind that made a particular sound when it hit the truck bed, metal instruments shifting against each other with a clink too precise to be hand tools. Adeline's eyes moved to the bag and stayed there a beat longer than politeness allowed. He noticed. He didn't explain. "I do woodwork too," he said, nodding toward the barn's broken fence rail as if the subject were already closed. "I'll need the shed cleared if I'm going to set up a bench." She let the moment pass, though something in her, the same instinct that had once noticed Thomas repeating himself at dinner 3 times before anyone else caught it, filed the satchel away for later. Some information declares itself immediately. Other information waits, patient as frost, for the right moment to surface. She showed him to the small caretaker's cabin behind the main house, explained the boundaries of the arrangement in a voice flattened by rehearsal, separate quarters, shared meals when convenient, 6 days a week of labor, Sundays his own, and watched him absorb the terms without negotiation, the way a man accepts weather rather than an offer. That evening, from the kitchen window, she watched him walk the fence line alone in the dying light, stopping every few dozen feet, crouching once beside a post, running his palm along a rail the way another man might check a fever. He did this for nearly an hour before the cold drove him inside. Adeline stood at the sink long after the water had gone cold in her hands, watching a stranger study her ruined property like a man reading an old wound, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel again. Not comfort, not yet, but the faint, unsettling sensation of being looked at by someone who noticed too much. By the end of his first week, Jonathan had repaired 11 fence posts, reinforced the barn's northern support beam, and rebuilt a hay feeder that had been broken since before Thomas died. He worked from before dawn until the light gave out, and he worked in near total silence, which Adeline found she preferred to conversation, until the morning he refused to enter Duchess's stall. Duchess was the mare carrying next spring's foal, sired before Ironhand's sale by a bloodline worth more than the truck Jonathan had arrived in. She was also, since a bad experience with a previous hand's rough handling, close to unmanageable, ears pinned at any approach, prone to kicking the stall boards hard enough to split them, a horse that had cost Adeline 2 ruined halters and a bruised hip in the past month alone. Jonathan stood at the stall door that morning with his satchel already open on a hay bale beside him, and instead of stepping in with a lead roped the way every hand before him had, he simply stood, watching, not moving toward the mare, not speaking, letting several long minutes pass while Duchess's ears swiveled toward him and away, toward him and away, gauging a threat that refused to announce itself. Adeline, arriving to check on progress, found this arrangement absurd enough to say so. "She won't come to you standing there," she said. "She needs a hand on the lead, firm, before she gets ideas." Jonathan didn't turn around. "She's not having ideas. She's remembering something." The comment sat between them, unexplained, the way a held breath sits in a room. Adeline waited for more. It didn't come. Instead, Jonathan crouched slowly, lowering himself to a height less threatening to a nervous animal, and began speaking to the mare in a register so low Adeline could catch only fragments. Nothing she recognized as command, more like the tone a person uses when they are apologizing for something they didn't do. It took him 40 minutes. At the end of it, Duchess lowered her head over the stall door and let him touch her jaw without flinching, something no one on the ranch had managed in 6 weeks. Adeline said nothing about it that night, but she found the ledger drawer harder to open than usual, the numbers inside less urgent for the length of one evening, replaced by a question she wasn't ready to ask out loud. What kind of hired hand studies an animal's fear like it's a diagnosis instead of a discipline problem? She got a partial answer 3 days later, when she walked into the tack room looking for a missing bridle and found Jonathan's satchel open on the workbench, its contents laid out in the deliberate order of a man who has done this 1,000 times. Sutures, a stethoscope older than some of the horses, a folded stack of notebooks, their covers soft with handling, and on the topmost page, visible before she could stop herself from reading it, a diagram of a mare's reproductive tract, annotated in small, careful handwriting that belonged to someone with training no ranch hand possessed. She closed the satchel before he returned. She did not mention it. But that night, lying awake in a house too quiet since Thomas died, Adeline began doing arithmetic of her own, the kind that adds a stranger's competence to a stranger's silence and arrives, uneasily, at a sum she wasn't ready to name. The first real conflict came not from Jonathan, but from town, specifically from a man named Marcus Whitfield, who arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday in a car too clean for the road it had traveled, representing what he called, with practiced smoothness, the interests of the County Creditors' Council. Whitfield was a land broker with a reputation for arriving exactly when properties were weakest, and he did not pretend otherwise. He stood in Adeline's kitchen, declined coffee, and laid out the terms with the efficiency of a man who had delivered the same speech to a dozen widows and struggling ranchers before her. The back taxes on the property were 16 months delinquent. The council, really, Whitfield himself and 2 silent partners with interests in regional timber rights, had been patient out of respect for Thomas's memory, but patience, he said, was not the same as charity. 60 days, he told her. Prove the ranch has a path to solvency, or the council recommends foreclosure and the land goes to auction. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that an Idaho Timber Consortium had already expressed interest in the acreage, assuming it became available. He mentioned Duchess by name. The mare's bloodline was apparently well known in certain circles, and suggested that a successful foaling, with the resulting colt sold at appropriate value, might be the only asset capable of demonstrating the viability the council required. Adeline listened to all of it without sitting down, which she understood, even as she did it, to be a kind of refusal to be pitted in her own kitchen. 60 days, she repeated, once he'd finished. Whitfield smiled in the particular way of men accustomed to being agreed with. 60 days. He left without shaking her hand, and Adeline stood at the window watching his clean car retreat down her ruined driveway, doing the math that had haunted her for over a year. 1 mare, 1 pregnancy, 1 narrow chance, and a debt that had been growing since long before she'd had the courage to look at it honestly. That evening, she told Jonathan everything, not out of trust, but because the arithmetic no longer worked without him. She told him about the deadline, about Duchess's value, about the timber consortium circling like something patient and well-fed. What she did not tell him was the truth about Thomas, the 18 months of quiet cover-up, the sale of Iron Hand that had gutted the ranch's future, the guilt she carried like a second mortgage nobody could see. Jonathan listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he asked only one question, and it was not about the money. Has the mare been checked by anyone since she came into full? Adeline admitted she'd been afraid to have the county vet out, afraid of a bill she couldn't pay, afraid of a diagnosis she couldn't survive. Jonathan nodded slowly. and something moved behind his expression that Adeline couldn't name yet, though she would understand it fully in the weeks to come. He said he would check the mare himself, in the morning, thoroughly. Adeline should have asked, then, how a carpenter learned to read a horse's reproductive health with a physician's precision. She didn't. Some silences are chosen because the truth arriving too early would cost more than the silence itself. She went to bed that night with 60 days circling in her head like something with teeth, unaware that the stranger sleeping in the caretaker's cabin carried a secret of his own, one that, if it surfaced at the wrong moment, could take the ranch down faster than any timber consortium ever could. The examination happened before sunrise, in the low gold light that made the barn look less broken than it was. Jonathan moved around Duchess with a stethoscope Adeline hadn't seen him unpack, his hands sure in a way that had nothing to do with carpentry, checking things Adeline didn't have names for, murmuring measurements to himself that she wrote down without understanding, because writing them down felt like doing something useful in a situation otherwise built from waiting. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and delivered the news the way a man delivers news he's delivered too many times before, plainly, without cushioning, because cushioning wastes time someone might not have. The foal is positioned wrong. Not dangerously, not yet. But if it doesn't correct itself before labor, there's a real chance of complications severe enough to lose them both. Adeline's hand found the stall door before her legs found the ground. "Can you fix it?" she said. Not really a question, more a demand aimed at fate. Jonathan's answer was careful in a way that told her more than the words did. "I can monitor it. If it doesn't correct, there are things that can be done. But they're not simple, and they're not risk-free, and out here, without proper facilities." He stopped himself. Adeline noticed the stop, filed it away, the way she'd filed away the satchel, the notebooks, the diagram of a mare's reproductive tract drawn by a hand too practiced to belong to a hired laborer. "Where did you learn to do this?" she asked, and this time she let the question sit in the open air between them instead of swallowing it. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He busied himself repacking the satchel, each instrument returning to its place with a precision that looked, in that moment, less like habit and more like armor. "Different life," he said finally. "Long time ago." It wasn't an answer. It was a door closing gently enough that pushing on it would have felt like cruelty. Adeline let it close. But she carried the unanswered question with her through the following days the way she carried the foreclosure notice in its drawer, present, unresolved, growing heavier the longer it went unopened. Winter arrived in earnest during the third week, dropping temperatures fast enough to crack the water trough's ice twice a day and turning the ranch's daily labor into something closer to survival than routine. Jonathan and Adeline fell into a working rhythm shaped by necessity rather than warmth. Mornings spent monitoring Duchess, afternoons spent on the endless list of repairs a failing ranch generates faster than two people could address them, evenings spent in a kitchen too quiet for two people who ate together but rarely spoke beyond logistics. The distance between them was not unfriendly. It was careful, the caution of two people who had each learned, separately, that trust extended too quickly tended to cost more than trust withheld. Adeline noticed things about Jonathan that accumulated slowly, like sediment. The way he flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever a phone rang in town during their supply runs. The way he avoided the county's small clinic entirely, routing their errands around it even when it cost extra time. The way, once, when a rancher 2 farms over stopped by asking after a fella who used to doctor horses for half the county. Jonathan had gone very still and let Adeline answer for him, deflecting with a vagueness that didn't match a man usually precise about everything else. She began to understand, without being told, that Jonathan Reyes was not simply a carpenter who happened to know animals. He had been something else once. Something the world had taken from him in a way that left marks he was still learning to carry without flinching. She might have let it go entirely, might have decided, the way she decided about her own hidden guilt over Thomas, that some truths served better buried. If not for the letter that arrived on a Thursday from the State Veterinary Licensing Board, addressed not to the ranch, but forwarded through a chain of old addresses to Jonathan Reyes, care of general delivery. She found it in the mailbox by accident, sorting through bills with hands numb from cold, and she recognized the seal before she recognized the implications. She did not open it. But she carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table where Jonathan would find it, and she watched, from across the room, his face when he did. He read it in silence, refolded in silence. And when he finally looked up, the composure he'd worn like a second coat since his arrival had cracked just enough to show what was underneath. Not anger, not defensiveness, but something closer to exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of a man who has been running from the same conversation for years and has just discovered it caught up to him anyway. "I was a veterinarian," he said, "for 22 years. Large animal, mostly. Horses, cattle." Adeline said nothing, giving him room the way he had given the mare room weeks before. There was an outbreak 3 years back. Equine influenza, aggressive strain, moving fast through a co-op herd insured by a company that decided the fastest way to stop the spread and the cheapest way to settle the claims was to euthanize the whole herd. 41 horses, most of them healthy, most of them treatable, if anyone had been willing to spend the time and money treating instead of settling. His hands, Adeline noticed, had gone still on the table, the way they went still around Duchess when the mare needed calm more than command. "I refused," he said, wrote it in the record, refused the order, treated the animals myself, saved 36 of the 41. The insurance company sued me for breach of contracted duty. The board investigated. It came down to whether a vet is obligated to follow a client's directive even when the vet believes it constitutes unnecessary cruelty. The board sided with the company. I lost my license, lost the practice, lost most of what I owned paying the legal fees trying to keep it. He looked up then, and the look carried none of the pride Adeline might have expected from a man defending a righteous choice. It carried only cost. "I've been doing carpentry and contract labor since. It's easier work, in a way. Nobody dies if I get it wrong." The kitchen held the silence for a long moment, the wind outside picking up against the windows, the first real gust of the storm that would arrive in full within the week. Adeline understood, in that silence, the shape of the decision now sitting in front of her, a decision she hadn't asked for and couldn't avoid. The letter in front of Jonathan wasn't just old business catching up. It was, she would learn over the following days, notice of a renewed civil suit. The original insurance company, restructured under new ownership, attempting once more to recover damages from a man who had already lost everything defending 41 lives that weren't his own to save. If the suit succeeded, Jonathan stood to lose what little he'd rebuilt. And if Adeline's own crisis with the bank deepened, if she needed, in the weeks ahead, to demonstrate the ranch's viability through expert testimony about Duchess's care, the obvious, easiest path forward involved using exactly the credential Jonathan had just confessed to losing. The temptation arrived quietly, the way temptations do. A man with 22 years of veterinary experience, properly credentialed on paper even if the license itself had been stripped, could provide exactly the kind of expert testimony the creditor's counsel would respect. It would strengthen her case enormously. It might be the difference between 60 days and survival. It would also, inevitably, drag Jonathan's name back into public record at precisely the moment a hostile insurance company was hunting for him. The storm that had been threatening all week arrived on a Tuesday morning with a violence that emptied the sky of color and turned the ranch into a study in white and gray. Snow fell sideways, driven by wind strong enough to bow the fence posts Jonathan had spent weeks reinforcing, and within hours the road to town had vanished beneath drifts too deep for Adeline's truck to manage. They worked through it anyway, because 41 horses do not stop needing care simply because the sky has turned hostile. Jonathan moved between stalls checking water lines for freeze, breaking ice with a mallet, hauling extra hay against a cold that seemed determined to punish the ranch for every year of neglect it had survived. Adeline worked beside him, and for the first time since his arrival, the silence between them carried something other than caution, a rhythm, unspoken, of two people who had stopped needing to explain their movements to each other. It was during a brief lull, both of them sheltering inside the barn's main aisle while the wind screamed outside, that Adeline finally asked the question she'd been circling for days. "If I tell the council what you used to be," she said, "it might save the ranch." She let that sit before continuing. "It might also bring that insurance company down on you before you're ready." Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He was coiling a length of rope, hand over hand, in the automatic rhythm of a man who needed his hands occupied while his mind worked through something larger. "You do that," he said finally. Not a question, not quite an accusation. Something in between. "I don't know," she admitted, and the admission cost her something visible, a small crack in the composure she'd worn as armor since Thomas died. "I've spent a year hiding a truth to protect someone I loved, and it nearly cost me everything. I don't know if I have it in me to do that again. Even for the ranch." Jonathan set the rope down. What truth? Adeline hadn't meant to open that door. But the storm outside, the isolation, the particular vulnerability of two people who had each just watched the other's carefully built composure show its cracks. It created a pressure that made honesty easier than it should have been. She told him about Thomas. About the 18 months of quiet decline she'd hidden from everyone, including herself, some nights. About Iron Hand, the stallion, the ranch's entire genetic future, sold without her knowledge for a third of his worth by a man whose mind had already begun leaving him, and who she had protected from the world's judgment even as that protection bankrupted them both. About the guilt that lived in her like a second mortgage, compounding daily, that she had never spoken aloud to a single living person. "I let him keep his dignity," she said, "and it cost us the ranch. I don't know if that was love or cowardice. I've never been able to tell the difference." The wind outside filled the silence that followed, and Jonathan, who had spent the conversation with his eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder, finally brought them back to her face. "Maybe it was both," he said. "Maybe most hard choices are." It wasn't absolution. It wasn't even comfort, not exactly. But it was the first moment since his arrival that felt less like two strangers sharing a house out of necessity, and more like two people who had each, separately, learned the same terrible lesson about love and silence and the debts they leave behind. Neither of them resolved the larger question that night: whether Adeline would use Jonathan's past to save the ranch, whether Jonathan would let her if she tried. But something had shifted in the barn's cold aisle, something neither of them named, and it carried them differently through the following morning, when Duchess, for the first time since Jonathan's arrival, allowed both of them into her stall together without pinning her ears. The choice arrived faster than either of them expected, forced by circumstance rather than deliberation. Whitfield returned to the ranch 11 days before the 60-day deadline, this time with one of the Timber Consortium's representatives in tow, a younger man in a coat too expensive for the weather who spent the entire visit looking at the property the way a person looks at something they've already mentally purchased. Whitfield's offer, delivered with the same practiced smoothness as before, was almost generous on its surface. The council would consider a 30-day extension, enough time to see Duchess through to foaling, if Adeline could demonstrate, through credible expert testimony, that the mare's pregnancy was being managed to a standard that guaranteed the resulting foal's value. He mentioned, with the casualness of a man laying a trap disguised as a favor, that he understood a properly credentialed veterinarian might be available to provide exactly that testimony, should Adeline choose to disclose it. Somehow, in a county small enough that secrets traveled faster than storms, Whitfield had learned enough about Jonathan's background to dangle it in front of her as leverage. Leverage that would help her, yes, but that would also, inevitably, hand Jonathan's name to exactly the kind of scrutiny his old insurance company would need to finish what they'd started 3 years earlier. Adeline stood on her own porch, in her own cold, and understood that Whitfield had just handed her the exact choice the entire winter had been building toward. Use Jonathan's past, save the ranch, or protect a man who had already lost everything once for refusing to sacrifice creatures that didn't need to die, and risk losing the only home she had left. She looked past Whitfield to where Jonathan stood near the barn, close enough to have heard everything, his posture very still in the particular way of a man bracing for a decision that wasn't his to make. "I won't be using anyone's credentials," Adeline said, and her voice didn't shake, though something in her chest did. "I'll demonstrate the ranch's viability myself, with my own work, my own numbers." If that's not enough for the council, then it was never going to be enough regardless of who signed the paperwork. Whitfield's expression flickered, surprise, briefly, followed by something almost like respect, quickly buried beneath professional disappointment. He reminded her, before leaving, that the deadline remained unchanged, and that the council's patience had limits regardless of principle. His car disappeared down the drive, taking with it the easiest path forward, and leaving Adeline standing in snow that had begun, once again, to fall. The choice cost exactly what choices like that tend to cost. Without expert testimony to strengthen her position, Adeline's meeting with the bank 2 days later went as poorly as she'd feared. The loan officer, sympathetic but bound by policy, explained that without additional collateral or a stronger demonstration of viability, the 60-day deadline would stand, immovable, regardless of any progress made with Duchess. Adeline drove home with a decision already forming, one she'd been avoiding since Thomas's funeral. The house held furniture that had belonged to 4 generations of her family, a dining table carved by her great-grandfather, a cabinet that had crossed the country in a covered wagon before the ranch existed, pieces that carried more history than monetary value, though the antique dealer in the county seat had, years ago, offered a figure large enough to matter now. She sold nearly all of it within the week. The dining table, the cabinet, a set of chairs older than the state of Montana itself. Jonathan helped her load the truck, saying little, though Adeline caught him once, hand resting on the cabinet's carved edge, in a stillness that suggested he understood exactly what the furniture represented and exactly what it cost her to let it go. The sale raised enough to cover the immediate interest and secure, through a private arrangement with the bank rather than the council, an additional 30 days, not the outcome Whitfield's offer would have guaranteed, but one that Adeline had earned without compromising the one thing in the whole ordeal that still felt like hers to protect. That evening, the house felt different, emptier in the obvious ways, but also, strangely, less burdened, as though the furniture had been carrying more than its own weight all along. Adeline stood in the bare dining room where a table had sat for 60 years, and Jonathan appeared in the doorway behind her, not speaking, simply present, the way he'd learned to be present with Duchess, patient, undemanding, offering nothing except the fact of staying. It was Adeline who crossed the distance between them that night, not with words, but with a hand extended toward his, tentative in a way that surprised her more than it seemed to surprise him. Jonathan took it. Neither of them said anything about what it meant. Some agreements don't need language. They only need 2 people willing to stand in an empty room together and not leave. The following morning, for the first time since Jonathan's arrival, Duchess allowed both of them to approach her together without a lead rope, without restraint, standing quiet in her stall while Jonathan checked the foal's position and Adeline stroked the mare's neck in long, steady strokes that Duchess leaned into rather than away from. It wasn't a cure. The foal's position remained imperfect, the risk still present. But it was trust, offered freely by an animal that had spent months refusing it, and both of them understood, without saying so, that it had been earned the same way everything else worth having on this ranch had been earned, slowly, through patience, through the refusal to force what could only be given. Before the storm, there was one more test, quieter than the others, but no less costly, and it arrived in the shape of Adeline's own children. Her daughter, Renata, came first, driving up from Bozeman on a Sunday with a tone in her voice, over the phone the week before, that had already announced her disapproval before she'd seen anything to disapprove of. Her son, Daniel, followed 2 days later from Spokane, ostensibly to check on his mother's well-being, though the timing, so close on his sister's heels, suggested a conversation the 2 of them had already had without their mother present. Renata was 30, sharp in the way her father had been sharp before illness dulled him, and she walked the property on arrival with the critical eye of someone building a case. She noted the new furniture in the front room, plainer than what she remembered, and asked, before she'd taken her coat off, where the dining table had gone. Adeline told her the truth, flatly, without apology, and watched her daughter's face do the complicated work of processing a sacrifice she hadn't been consulted about and wouldn't have approved if she had been. "You sold Grandma Eleanor's table to keep a stranger housed here," Renata said, and the accusation embedded in the sentence didn't require elaboration. "I sold it to keep this ranch," Adeline answered. "Jonathan works for his keep the same as I do. He's not a guest." Renata's eyes moved, then, to where Jonathan stood near the paddock fence, close enough to have heard, far enough to pretend otherwise, and something in her expression shifted from suspicion toward a colder, more practical concern. "You married him," she said. "Legally. That's what the agency arrangement means, isn't it? You married a man you've known 4 months to satisfy a residency clause, and now his name is attached to everything you own." It was not an unfair question. Adeline had turned the same fear over in her own mind more nights than she cared to admit. The vulnerability of tying her remaining assets, however modest, to a man whose full history she had learned only in fragments, whose old case with the insurance company remained an open wound that could, in theory, reach toward the ranch itself if it ever escalated into judgment against him personally. She had built protections into the paperwork, careful ones, drafted by a lawyer in the county seat who specialized in exactly this kind of arrangement. She explained this to Renata as plainly as she could, though she understood, watching her daughter's face, that no explanation delivered in a single Sunday conversation was going to dissolve suspicion built over a lifetime of watching their father's slow decline mishandled in silence. Daniel's visit, 2 days later, took a different shape entirely. Where Renata's concern had been financial and legal, Daniel's was quieter, more personal, carrying an old grief neither sibling had fully processed. He found Jonathan alone in the barn workshop, sanding a length of fence rail with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. And instead of confrontation, Daniel simply stood in the doorway for a long while, watching, the way a man watches something he's trying to understand rather than judge. "You knew Dad was sick before he died, didn't you?" Daniel said eventually, though the question wasn't really aimed at Jonathan at all. "Mom never told us how bad it got. We found out after, going through his papers. The stallion sale. All of it." Jonathan set the rail down carefully. "That's not mine to discuss." "I'm not asking you to discuss it," Daniel said. "I'm asking if you understand what you walked into. She's been carrying that alone for 2 years. Nobody else has been willing to stand close enough to help her carry it. It was, Adeline would learn later, the closest either of her children came that weekend to giving Jonathan something like approval. Not trust, not yet, but the grudging acknowledgement that whatever arrangement their mother had built with a stranger, it had produced something neither of them could easily name, but both of them could see. Standing in the particular steadiness Jonathan brought to a barn that had once terrified a mare into violence and now, months later, held an animal calm enough to let a hired stranger check her pulse without restraint. Both children left by Monday morning, neither fully reconciled to the choices Adeline had made, both carrying with them a version of the ranch's story they would tell differently for years afterward. But something had shifted in their departure that hadn't been present in their arrival. A loosening of the vigilance they'd carried since their father's death, a willingness, however reluctant, to let their mother's judgment stand without further audit. Adeline watched their cars disappear down the long drive and felt the particular exhaustion of a woman who had just defended a life she was still, herself, in the process of understanding. Jonathan came to stand beside her on the porch, saying nothing, offering nothing beyond his presence, and Adeline found that his silence, this time, asked for nothing in return. It simply stayed. The blizzard that nearly ended everything arrived 3 weeks ahead of Duchess's due date. In the particular way emergencies arrive, not as a single dramatic event, but as a slow accumulation of small failures that only reveal their true shape once it's too late to prevent them. It began as an ordinary storm, the kind the ranch had weathered a dozen times that winter. By mid-afternoon, the wind had strengthened enough to knock down the phone line running from the county road, a line already weakened by ice and age, severing the ranch's only reliable connection to outside help. By evening, the snow had piled high enough against the barn's south wall to make the main road impassable even for the county's plow trucks, stranding the ranch in a silence broken only by wind and, as the hours wore on, the increasingly distressed sounds coming from Duchess's stall. The mare went into labor at 11 that night, 3 weeks premature, in a storm that made even the short walk between house and barn a genuine danger. Jonathan was in the stall within minutes, Adeline close behind with lanterns and towels and every scrap of calm she could force into her hands, which shook despite her best effort to still them. The examination that followed confirmed what Jonathan had feared since the pregnancy's earliest weeks. The foal's position, never fully corrected, had shifted further wrong under the stress of early labor, presenting a complication that, in any ordinary circumstance, would have meant an emergency call to the nearest large animal surgical facility, 90 minutes away on a road that no longer existed beneath the snow. There was no ambulance for horses out here. No phone line to call one even if there had been. There was only a licensed veterinarian working from memory and a canvas satchel of instruments meant for gentler procedures, a terrified mare in genuine danger of losing her life along with her foals, and a widow whose hands had never done anything more medically demanding than bandage a cut, about to become the only surgical assistance available for a procedure that, done wrong, could kill them both. Jonathan's voice, when he spoke, carried none of the composure Adeline had grown used to. It carried instead the flat, focused urgency of a man who understood exactly how narrow the path forward had become. "I need you to trust me completely for the next hour," he said, already moving, already opening the satchel with hands that had gone perfectly steady despite everything. "I need you to do exactly what I say when I say it, and I need you not to look away no matter what you see." Adeline, who had spent 14 months learning to survive by looking away from the things too painful to face directly, understood in that moment that looking away was no longer an option available to her. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, and meant it more completely than she had meant anything in over a year. What followed was the longest hour of Adeline Vance's life. Jonathan's hands working inside the birth canal to correct a position that fought him at every turn, his voice low and constant. Narrating instructions Adeline followed with a precision born entirely of terror and love in equal measure, holding pressure where he directed, passing instruments she'd never seen before with hands slick with sweat despite the barn's bitter cold. Duchess screamed twice, sounds that would live in Adeline's memory for the rest of her life. And at the worst moment, when the mare's strength seemed to fail entirely, when Jonathan's face went pale in a way Adeline had never seen, when the wind outside chose that exact moment to tear a section of roofing loose with a crack like a rifle shot, Adeline understood, with total clarity, that they might lose them both, the mare and the foal, in the next several minutes, and there was nothing beyond the two of them and the storm to prevent it. She did not look away. She held pressure exactly where instructed, spoke to Duchess in the same low register Jonathan used, the two of them working as a single unit born from months of quiet trust neither had fully acknowledged until the moment it became the only thing standing between life and loss. The foal came free at 12:47 in the morning, 3 weeks early, dangerously small, and entirely, miraculously alive. For a long moment neither Adeline nor Jonathan moved. The barn held its breath along with them, the storm outside suddenly distant, muffled by four wooden walls and the particular silence that follows survival. Duchess lifted her head toward the small, wet shape beside her, exhausted, and began the slow work every mare does instinctively, cleaning a foal that trembled but breathed, its ribs rising and falling in a rhythm too fast and too fragile to feel entirely safe yet. Jonathan sat back against the stall wall, hands still stained, and for the first time since his arrival at the ranch, something in his posture broke open completely, not into words, not into tears exactly, but into a stillness so total it seemed to require the whole of him to maintain. Adeline lowered herself beside him without asking permission, shoulder against shoulder, both of them watching a foal they had nearly lost find its legs for the first time, folding and unfolding beneath a body too new to trust yet. "You did that," Adeline said, quietly enough that the words nearly disappeared into the barn's returning silence. "We did that," Jonathan answered, and it was the first time all winter he had used the word we without qualification, without the careful distance he'd maintained since the day he arrived, determined to be nothing more than a hired hand. Neither of them moved to correct the other. The storm broke by morning, the way storms eventually do, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like its own kind of aftermath. The road remained impassable for another full day, and Adeline used the enforced stillness to do the only thing that felt necessary: sit in the barn's aisle, watching a foal on unsteady legs discover the shape of the world it had nearly not survived to see, while Jonathan slept in short, exhausted intervals against a hay bale nearby, unwilling to leave the stall even once the immediate danger had passed. When the plow finally cleared the county road, it brought with it, 3 days later, a visit from Marcus Whitfield that neither of them had anticipated so soon. He arrived expecting, Adeline suspected, to find a ranch further diminished by the storm, another reason to press his case for liquidation. What he found instead was a healthy foal, small, but strong, already carrying in its markings and its movement the unmistakable bloodline that made its dam valuable in the first place. And two people who had spent a night neither of them would ever fully describe to an outsider, standing together in a barn that had held, against every reasonable expectation, through the worst the winter had to offer. Whitfield's assessment of the foal, delivered with the professional detachment of a man accustomed to evaluating livestock as collateral, was more generous than Adeline had dared hope. The bloodline held. The foal's early survival, against genuine odds, spoke to management the council would have to acknowledge, regardless of whose credentials had or hadn't been formally disclosed. He did not ask again about Jonathan's background. Perhaps he'd already learned enough on his own. Perhaps, standing in a barn that told its own story more persuasively than any document could, he understood that pressing the matter further would cost him more in credibility than it might gain him in leverage. Whatever his reasoning, the council's final report, delivered 11 days later, within the extended deadline Adeline's furniture had purchased, recommended a restructured payment plan rather than foreclosure, citing demonstrated operational viability and the successful management of a high-value breeding asset through what the report dryly called adverse conditions. The Timber Consortium's representative did not return. Adeline never learned whether that was Whitfield's decision or someone else's higher up the chain, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she no longer needed to know. The ranch would survive. Not easily, not without years of continued work ahead, but survive, on terms that belonged entirely to her, built from her own labor and her own choices, without a single piece of Jonathan's past sacrifice to secure them. Spring arrived slowly that year, the way it does in mountain country, reluctant and incomplete for weeks before finally committing. The foal, a colt, eventually named Iron Hands, returned by a ranch hand's suggestion that made Adeline laugh for the first time in longer than she could remember, grew steady and strong through the thaw, kept close to his dam in a paddock Jonathan had rebuilt board by board through the winter's remaining cold months. The house held new furniture by then, simpler pieces bought secondhand from an estate sale 2 counties over, nothing with the weight of 4 generations behind it, but functional, warm, arranged by 2 people who had stopped needing to negotiate the boundaries between separate quarters and shared space. The paper marriage that had begun as a legal convenience had, somewhere in the months between a blizzard and a foal's first unsteady steps, become something neither of them had planned for and both of them had, eventually, stopped pretending not to want. Word of the insurance company's civil suit finally arrived that spring, not as a resolution, but as a postponement. The case folded quietly into a broader settlement the restructured company negotiated to avoid a costlier trial over a different herd, a different county, a different veterinarian who'd made the same refusal Jonathan had made years earlier and lived through it with less to lose. Jonathan's name was dropped from active litigation, though not cleared, not restored. The license itself remaining a closed door. The state board showed no interest in reopening. He read the letter announcing it, standing in the same kitchen where the first letter had arrived months before, and this time Adeline watched no crack appear in his composure, only a long exhale, the particular stillness of a man setting down a weight he had carried so long he'd forgotten what walking without it felt like. "It isn't justice," he said, folding the letter the way he'd folded the first one. "No," Adeline agreed, "but it's quiet. Maybe that's what you get instead, some years." He didn't argue with that. Some truths, once accepted rather than fought, made room for something steadier to grow in their place. It was not a story without cost. Jonathan's old case, the renewed civil suit from the insurance company that had stripped his license years earlier, remained unresolved, working its slow way through courts that owed neither of them urgency or sympathy. He carried that uncertainty visibly some mornings, a tightness around his eyes that Adeline had learned to recognize and had learned, too, not to try to talk him out of. Some wounds needed to be carried rather than explained away. Adeline, for her part, still opened the ledger drawer some nights out of habit, still felt the old guilt about Thomas surface occasionally, unbidden, in moments of quiet she hadn't expected it to find. Neither of them had been repaired completely by the winter they'd survived together. They had simply learned, in the space that survival required, how to carry their separate damage without asking the other to disappear it. What had changed, unmistakably, was the quality of the silence between them. It no longer carried the careful distance of two strangers guarding themselves against disappointment. It carried instead the particular ease of two people who had chosen, deliberately and at real cost, to stop performing strength for each other and had discovered, in that vulnerability, something sturdier than either of them had expected to find again. Late in the spring, Adeline found herself back on the porch where the whole winter had effectively begun, watching the colt run wide, uncertain circles around his grazing dam, while Jonathan worked at the fence line nearby, no longer studying the ranch like a wound, but tending it like something worth the effort of healing. The comparison arrived unbidden, the way old memories do. The letter she had written 9 months earlier. Carpentry, heavy stock work, a purely practical arrangement, nothing more. She had asked, in that letter, for exactly what she believed she needed, certain that anything beyond it would only complicate a situation already too fragile to bear complication. What had arrived instead was a man who refused every expectation she'd carried into that agreement, who brought with him not the rough competence of a hired hand, but the quiet, hard-won wisdom of someone who had already lost everything once for refusing to abandon a creature that needed saving. The ranch had not been rescued by strength, in the end, or by the rigid terms of a contract written out of fear. It had been rescued by two people willing to set aside what they'd expected from each other and offer, instead, the far harder thing, their own unguarded vulnerability, given freely, in a barn during a storm neither of them had been prepared for. Jonathan looked up from the fence line, caught her watching, and didn't look away. Neither did she. Some partnerships are built to fulfill an old picture of what a life is supposed to look like. This one had been built from the wreckage of two old pictures, neither of which had survived, and had become, in the space that wreckage left behind, something neither of them had known to ask for. But both of them, standing in the thin spring light of a ranch that had nearly been lost twice over, understood they were no longer willing to live without. The foal ran another wide circle, found his footing, and did not fall. Neither did they.